Hey everybody, with Joe Biden out of office and in the rear view, it's time to take a final look at his approval ratings. So I've got a few different sources here, and then at the end, we'll compare a little bit to Donald Trump. So we're going to start here at 538. And over the past 2.5 years, I've done maybe 5 or 6 videos on Biden's approval rating. But now that all the data is final, we've got to see how Biden did. Now, to be technically completely fair, if Biden is around at the next election, he could theoretically run for a second term like Trump did. So you never know, we could be looking at a non-consecutive term for Biden when he's in his mid to late 80s. Anyway, here on 538, Biden finishes on January 20th with a net 20% disapproval rating. Now, sometimes you might see his approval rating and also his favorability rating. Those are technically two separate metrics. Usually, job approval rating is the preferred one. It does a little bit better job separating out his policies from any personal attributes. So a 57% disapproval rating and only 37% approve, and that is in the aggregate. That's not just one poll. Now, if you go down here, you can take a look at the individual polls that were factored into that average. 538 does a good job here showing the dates the polls were conducted at, the sample size, the pollster, the weight of the poll, and then the actual poll and any adjusted numbers. So I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any pollster, even a highly democratically favorable pollster, that shows Biden even close to any positive rating. You can see these are all double digits underwater. So there's really no groundbreaking information here. Biden, not at all popular. The end of his presidency is certainly no exception. Some of the pardons and things he might have done on his way out of office, probably not going to be a good look. There might be some other things you do like, but those are the things that are going to get the attention. And let's go on to the other major aggregate. We've got real clear politics. And here at the end, Biden is looking just a little bit better. He's at 39% approved compared to 37 at 538. The disapproval rating is about the same at 57. He's 18 points underwater here. And then you can see the polls that went into this aggregate. Now, the good thing about real clear politics is you can see the average for his entire term. And it's low, but it's higher than it was at the end. It's at 43.2, 52.5 disapprove. He's underwater, but it's not by double digits. It's at 9.3. Now look at the trajectory of Biden during his term. In his first year, he averaged a pretty respectable 49.6%. That was above water by more than 4 points. But then it completely dropped off. It was 41.3 in 2022. Then in 23, it was 42.1, just marginally better. And then this final year, it dropped down to 40.4. So some weak ratings there, but how did we get here? Well, if we go down to the graph, you can see Biden definitely started off in positive territory. He was well above water for a few months. So the honeymoon period is real. However, once we got into the summer, July, and then August, there was the Afghanistan withdrawal. That was the major event that seemed to change Biden's ratings into the negative, and it really never got close to recovering from that point. For the rest of 21, well underwater, and then in 22, there was the Supreme Court decision on abortion that also tanked Biden's approvals. Then the midterms rolled around. Biden was definitely unpopular, and it looked like Dems were going to take a beating. He did lose control of the House, but other than that, not a bad night for Biden, all things considered. From that point on, Biden's rating recovered just a little bit, but then after that, it pretty much dropped off. That takes us into the 2024 primaries, and then the disastrous debate performance at the end of June. It looks to be close to when Biden was at his lowest. Then after the 2024 election and the final couple of months, there was absolutely no improvement here for Biden. So why was Biden so unpopular? Well, I think there's 3 dominant factors. One of them is definitely inflation. We came out of COVID the first year with Biden in office with the vaccines, etc. But then prices started to go up, and at first we kept hearing it's going to be transitory, don't worry about it. Of course, that was totally false. Everything kept going up, and it stayed up. That's a huge factor that goes into these approval ratings. The other issue is, of course, going to be immigration. The perception of a weak or a wide open border, migrants pouring in with totally unsatisfying accountability, and resources being strained at various cities. That's another huge reason. And the final factor I think is going to be Biden's age. Let's face it, Biden got old, and some people can carry it pretty well, but with Biden, there was no covering that up whatsoever. A lot of the media said it was completely inappropriate to say anything like that, and we hear that Biden is totally sharp as a tack behind the scenes. A lot of Americans were not buying it. It was all completely exposed during that presidential debate. Now, there's a ton of other factors that go into the rating. You could talk about Israel, crime, trade, guns, etc. But the one thing I'll say to Biden's credit is I think it's going to be pretty tough for any president to have a rating that is not at least a little bit in the red. There's a lot of anger out there. There's a lot of polarization. You might say it's a surprise here that Biden's rating was not actually lower than this, maybe in the low 30s or high 20s. The things that Democrats kept bragging about, like infrastructure, Build Back Better, or the CHIPS Act, or how they've got inflation under control compared to other countries. My take on that is it seemed to be too little too late. So I'll leave it up to you to decide how much of this negative approval rating is warranted or if some of it might be a little bit unfair. Now, if you want to try to take a look at some other polling outlets, we've got Gallup. They're a fairly respected and long-time pollster. They've got Biden finishing with a 40% approval rating here, and that's just up a tick from where it was back in November and December. But it's pretty much the same path you could see going back to the beginning of his presidency, where he topped out at 57%. He was also there a few months later, but then after that, it was a big drop-off. And if you go down here, you can see here, Gallup has his approval rating average from the entire term at 42.2. His peak was 57, like we just saw, and his low point was 36 in July of 24. That's again going to be right after that debate meltdown. Now, there's some other sources you might take a look at. We've got one here from Reuters Ipsos. The only problem is they stopped updating this as of September 5th. No idea why they would do that. They did it the entire term. That wasn't even after the election. So they kind of gave up with a few months to go. But here Biden was at a 37% approval rating, and the path before that is similar to what we just saw. Down here they do break it down with some different demographics. Of course, Democrats had a very high approval rating at first, but even then it dropped down to 74%. Sounds high, but that's actually low considering that's your base of support. And meanwhile, Republicans were almost unanimously opposed at 91%. Now, the other source we can use here is going to be Civiqs, and the entire sample here was over 550,000 registered voters. That's a ton. So again, we can see Biden started off here just a little bit positive, not as much as we saw on some of the aggregates. So he was a little bit above water, but then it dropped off again once they got into the summer. Ever since then, it's been well underwater until he finished at about 38% approved. What's helpful about this site is they have some significant events here at the top, so you can see where his approval rating might have changed as a result. Sometimes these events matter, sometimes not so much. So I think it's pretty clear here, weak approval ratings for Biden. Now on the left here, you can click and break it down by different demographics. For example, here's 18 to 34. And it's terrible. He's at 30% approve. How about 35 to 49? A little bit better there, 38% approve. How about 50 to 64? Very similar, 39 approve. And how about the oldest group, 65 plus? There, Biden kind of looking his best yet at 42% approve. We can clear that and we can sort by non-college graduates. That's going to give Biden a low 34% approval. How about college graduates? That takes Biden up to 39% approve. And then postgraduates, that's where you're going to see this graph flip. Biden's going to have a positive approval rating here. It's at 9% above water at 50%. So you can do this all day if you'd like. The other key group I want to focus on is going to be independents. There, Biden is at an abysmal 27% approval rating. That's considerably lower than his overall approval rating. Now, even though these are pretty terrible numbers for Biden, also consider the election results. We're not an absolute massive landslide like these approval ratings. Even though it was Harris in there instead of Biden, I don't think Biden would have only gotten 27% of independents. If he did, there would have been a bunch more states that would have went in Trump's column. So approval ratings do not necessarily equal election results. But of course, if you're so far underwater, that is going to give you a good indication of your chances in an actual election. So one other Biden metric we're going to take a look at is going to be his favorability rating and not his job approval rating. In Biden's case, it's actually pretty similar. It's at 38% favorable, 57% unfavorable. Now this actually goes back before his presidency. This was during the Trump years. He was above water by 4 to 8%. Then when Biden ran in that 2020 primary, his unfavorability rating shot way up. It really looked like he had absolutely no chance at being the nominee for the Dems. I was pretty stunned when it happened. After Buttigieg and Klobuchar dropped out, Clyburn rallied everybody around Biden, and then all of a sudden he became the nominee. In the midst of the pandemic, that was enough for Biden to just barely eke out a win in 2020. But then we know the rest of the story. Everything goes wrong, and Biden's favorability rating tanks. So again, I don't want to completely oversimplify. You can maybe just boil everything down to inflation and the economy, but there's always going to be a lot of other factors that might go into some of these numbers. Now, the last thing we're going to do is glance at some of the numbers for Donald Trump, but we're not going to take a look at his new job approval rating just yet. We already did that last week. We're going to see what Trump did on his first term, and this is real simple. Trump's approval rating here was remarkably steady during the entire 4 years. That was during some positive economic times and a lot of negative coverage in the media, plus the pandemic hit and a lot of fallout from that, and then January 6th, and his approval rating did not really budge all that much throughout everything. On the flip side, it was not a strong approval rating. It was mostly in the low 40s, and that's kind of similar to what we saw from Biden. But it almost seemed like nothing was going to change Trump's approval rating in a dramatic way. And the other thing to point out here is if you look at independents, this is a stark contrast from what we saw with Joe Biden. Their approval rating almost completely overlaps with the overall approval rating. The numbers are very similar, not a lot of variance. Remember, Biden's rating with independents was much lower than his overall rating. With Trump, again, it all evens out to where everything looks steady. So I don't know if it's going to be different with Trump in his second term, but with everything we saw in term number 1, some people are thrilled by it, some people think it was a complete circus. Almost nothing was going to move the needle. So it's going to be fun to see what happens during the next 4 years. Finally, let's take a look at Trump's favorability rating instead of his job approval rating. This goes back to before he was president, back to the end of 2015. His favorability rating was also very low, only 28% here. And then after that, and when he got elected, it's been pretty much the same ever since, about 44% for several years straight. Then it went down a little bit in 23 when he started getting indicted. But then in 24 and then into 25 here, it started to narrow up a little bit. Trump did have multiple assassination attempts, but at the time that did not really seem to boost his polling all that much. It almost had no effect. But slowly over the final months after his second win, his favorability rating is back up here now to about 46%. So still underwater, but it's by only 6 points. It's hard to imagine that actually getting above water, but you never know. So I guess now Trump is still at the peak of his popularity, but it's very early. I think we've got to give him at least the first 100 days until things might settle down. But for now, he's got a little bit of a honeymoon period, and he is doing better than Joe Biden was outside of the first 6 months of his presidency. So let's look at Biden and a little bit of Trump's approval ratings. So let me know in the comments. What do you think about Joe and his approval rating? Do you trust the polling? Do you think it should be higher? Do you think it should be lower? What are the biggest factors that contributed to that rating? Was there anything he could have done to turn it around? And how do you think history is going to judge Biden? And what do you make of Trump's approval rating, especially with independents? Let me know down below. On your way out, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Join if you'd like to support the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.